Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're diving into Asking the Right Questions, A Guide to Critical Thinking by M. Neil Browne and Stuart M. Keeley. It's really about, how do we sift through all the information we're bombarded with every day and figure out what to actually believe?
It's a crucial skill in today's world, right?
Absolutely.
So this book really pushes you to go beyond just passively absorbing everything like a sponge. The authors call it panning for gold. You're actively searching for those nuggets of truth.
Okay, so instead of just accepting everything we hear, we're digging a little deeper looking for those golden insights.
Exactly. And the book gives you a really practical framework for doing that. One of the first steps is identifying the core of an argument.
So what's the main issue?
Right. What's the issue? What's the author actually trying to convince you of?
So before we even start evaluating the evidence or anything, we need to figure out what the conclusion is and what reasons they're giving to support it.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And the book uses some really clear examples. There's one about metal detectors in schools. And they break down the argument, they pinpoint the conclusion, they show you how to identify the supporting reasons.
Which is key because those reasons could be based on flawed logic or shaky assumptions.
Right. Absolutely. And
yeah.
Speaking of assumptions, that's another big thing the book tackles.
Because we make assumptions all the time without even realizing it, right?
All the time.
Yeah.
And the book really zeroes in on what they call value assumptions. So these are the deeply held beliefs that we have about what's good or bad, what's right or wrong.
Okay, so it's less about facts and more about our values.
Right.
Like those deeply ingrained beliefs that shape our worldview.
Exactly.
Like in that example of the different workplace environments. Some people might value competition while others prioritize collaboration. And that shapes their entire view of which environment is better.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how these assumptions can really color our interpretations even if we're not aware of them.
And sometimes the language itself can be misleading. The book talks about ambiguity words or phrases with multiple possible meanings.
Oh, that reminds me of those, ads that promise amazing results but are super vague about what those results actually are. Like, this product will change your life.
Right.
Okay, but how?
Right. And the authors give you a whole bunch of questions to ask when you encounter this ambiguous language. Like, what are the different ways this word or phrase could be interpreted? What's the context?
Yeah, because that context can make a huge difference in the money.
Huge difference. And then there's the whole issue of fallacies.
Fallacies.
Which are basically reasoning tricks, ways to persuade you even when the argument isn't logically sound.
Okay, sneaky tactics.
Yeah, the book provides a whole list of these fallacies, like the ad hominem, where you attack the person instead of the argument itself.
Yeah, like saying you can't trust her opinion on climate change because she flies private jets.
Yeah.
Total deflection.
Exactly. And then there's the slippery slope, where you claim that one action will inevitably lead to this chain of disastrous consequences, even though there's no real evidence to support that.
Oh, I hear that one all the time.
Yeah.
If we let kids choose their bedtime, next thing you know, they'll be staying up all night and failing their classes.
Exactly.
It's a classic.
And the book goes into a lot more of these fallacies, appealing to popularity, appealing to questionable authority, the straw person fallacy. But the important thing is to be able to recognize them.
Right. Because they can be really persuasive if you're not paying attention. So we've talked about assumptions, ambiguity, and fallacies. But what about the actual evidence itself? How do we evaluate that?
That's key, right? And the book breaks down different types of evidence. Personal experience, testimonials, appeals to authority research studies, and each type has its strengths and weaknesses.
So it's not just about whether evidence exists. It's about the quality of that evidence.
Exactly.
So, just because my uncle lost weight on a certain diet doesn't mean it's the right diet for everyone. Personal experience can be compelling, but it's often limited.
Absolutely. And then testimonials, while they can be moving, they're often cherry-picked. They don't give you the full picture.
Like those ads with glowing reviews, but you never hear from the people who didn't have a positive experience.
Right.
What about appeals to authority? Those can be tricky.
They can be very tricky. Because just because someone is an expert doesn't mean they're always right. Especially if their area of expertise isn't relevant to the issue at hand.
Right. So we can't just blindly trust anyone with a fancy title.
Exactly. You got to look at their biases, their qualifications, their track record.
So we need to be asking ourselves, is this person truly qualified to speak on this topic?
Exactly.
And then research studies. I mean, those can be very informative, but
it can be.
They're not all created equal, are they?
Not at all. We need to consider things like sample size, methodology, potential biases, whether the study has been replicated.
So critical thinking requires us to be evidence detectives, scrutinizing where the information came from and how it was gathered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then even when we're dealing with statistics, which seems so objective,
Oh, statistics.
you got to be on guard. They can be so misleading. Absolutely. Even when they're technically accurate.
That's why the book devotes a whole section to deciphering statistics. It exposes all these common statistical manipulations, confusing averages, using unknowable or biased data omitting relevant information.
It's like that saying, there are lies, damned lies in statistics.
Exactly. And the book gives us the tools to see through those statistical smokescreens.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into those statistical traps in part 2.
One of the trickiest things about statistics is how easily averages can be manipulated.
Oh, yeah. You hear about the average, this or that all the time, but I guess it really depends on what kind of average is being used.
Right. You could have a company boasting about its average salary being really high, but if they're using the mean, which is skewed by a few executives making millions, it doesn't really reflect the reality for most employees. Totally misleading.
And the book really encourages us to ask, what kind of average are we talking about here? Is it the mean, the median, the mode? And how might that be distorting our understanding?
It's like a subtle but powerful way to manipulate data. So what are some other ways that statistics can be used to mislead?
Well, the book also talks about this idea of concluding one thing but proving another.
What does that mean?
It's like they're trying to pull a fast one on you. They'll use data that supports one claim to justify a completely different, often unrelated claim.
Okay, so like that example with the weight loss drug.
Exactly. The company might say 90% of people experience no side effects.
Sounds good.
But that doesn't actually prove that the drug works for weight loss.
Right. They're talking about safety, but implying effectiveness.
Exactly. They're two totally different things.
So as critical thinkers, we've got to be careful that the statistics being presented actually align with the conclusion being drawn. Don't let those sneaky marketers trick you. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of deceiving by omitting crucial information. This is where it gets really interesting because it's not about what's being said, but what's being left unsaid.
It's like the tip of the iceberg, you know? What you see on the surface might not be the whole story.
And sometimes that hidden information is essential for understanding the full picture. I imagine this happens a lot with things like risk statistics.
Oh, absolutely. The book highlights how the way risk is presented can totally change our perception, like focusing on relative risk reduction instead of absolute risk reduction.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So let's say a treatment reduces your risk of something by 33%. That sounds pretty impressive, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But what if that 34% reduction is only a relative reduction, meaning it's a 33% decrease from a very small risk to begin with?
Ah, okay. So the actual reduction in your absolute risk might be much smaller.
Exactly.
Like maybe it only goes from a 3% risk to a 2% risk.
Right. So it's still a reduction, but not as dramatic as that 33% might make it seem.
That makes a lot of sense.
So we need to be aware of these subtle manipulations. Always ask, what's the absolute risk reduction here? And what are the potential downsides of this treatment that might not be mentioned?
Because sometimes a treatment that sounds amazing on the surface might have hidden risks or drawbacks that outweigh the benefits.
Exactly.
So we've talked about averages, sneaky conclusions, omitted information, and risk statistics. Is there anything else we should be wary of when encountering statistics?
Well, it's important to remember that statistics are never presented in a vacuum.
Right.
They're always framed within a particular context, and that context can heavily influence our interpretation.
So like a statistic about crime rates might be presented in a way that makes a city seem more dangerous than it really is.
Right.
Or unemployment figures could be selectively chosen to fit a certain political agenda.
Exactly. We have to think critically about the source of the statistics, their purpose, any potential biases that might be at play.
So it's not just about understanding the numbers themselves. It's about understanding the story those numbers are being used to tell.
Right.
And sometimes that story might not be the whole truth.
Exactly.
The book encourages us to approach statistics with a healthy dose of skepticism
Absolutely.
and to always dig a little deeper.
Ask those probing questions. Consider different interpretations.
It's such an important message because we're constantly bombarded with statistics these days, from news headlines to social media posts to those flashy advertisements.
And they're often used to persuade us, to influence our opinions, to shape our perceptions.
That's why critical thinking is absolutely essential in this day and age.
Absolutely.
So what are some key takeaways for navigating this statistical minefield?
Well, first of all, be wary of any statistic that seems too good to be true.
If it sounds outrageous or overly sensational,
It's probably worth looking into more closely.
don't just take things at face value. Question everything.
Absolutely. And be super skeptical of statistics presented without context or any supporting information. Who collected the data? What was their method? What are the limitations of the study?
Those details matter.
They make a huge difference in how we interpret those numbers.
Okay, good to know.
And lastly, remember that statistics can be used to support a wide range of conclusions. Just because a statistic is accurate doesn't mean the interpretation is valid. Always think about alternative explanations.
Like those rival causes we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
This deep dive into statistics has been incredibly eye-opening. It's a reminder that numbers can be powerful tools, but they can also be used to mislead.
Absolutely. But the good news is we all have the power to become critical thinkers.
We can question the information we're given.
We can make up our own minds.
This book gives us the tools to do just that. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into asking the right questions. And this time we're putting on our detective hats.
That's right. We're becoming information detectives, learning how to spot those crucial pieces of information that might be missing.
Because, let's face it, we are drowning in information these days. News, social media advertisements, even casual conversations. It can feel overwhelming.
It can be so easy to just passively absorb whatever we're told. But this book is all about empowering us to be more discerning.
To dig deeper.
To dig deeper and ask, what's missing here?
That is such a powerful question. Because sometimes what's left unsaid can be just as important as what is said.
Absolutely. It's like that old saying, the devil is in the details. Or in this case, maybe the devil is in what's not detailed.
Right.
And the book gives us a framework for uncovering those hidden details. It reminds us that every piece of communication is going to have some degree of incompleteness.
Incompleteness.
Limitations of time, space, attention span even our own knowledge.
So it's not about expecting every source to be perfectly comprehensive. It's more about being aware that there might be missing information and actively looking for it.
Right. And one of the first things we need to consider is the communicator's perspective.
Their perspective.
What are their biases? What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve by presenting the information this way?
Yeah, like if a company's trying to sell me something, I'm going to be a lot more skeptical of their claims than if I'm reading a neutral third-party review.
Exactly. And it's not just about being wary of overt marketing tactics either. Subtle biases can creep into any communication.
Even from sources we generally trust.
Even from sources we generally trust.
So we're always on the lookout for those red flags, those hints that something might be missing or that the information might not be as objective as it seems.
Right. The book gives us a bunch of helpful questions to ask when we're trying to identify omitted information.
Okay, like what?
Like, what are the potential downsides of this course of action? Are there alternative viewpoints that haven't been considered?
Okay.
Is there any conflicting evidence out there?
Those are great questions to keep in mind. They force you to look beyond the surface and consider the bigger picture.
And one type of omitted information that's particularly important to consider is the potential negative effects of a decision.
The negative effects.
It's easy to get swept up in the excitement of a new idea, but we also need to weigh the potential risks and drawbacks.
Yeah, like if someone is proposing a new law, it's important to consider not just the intended benefits, but also any unintended consequences that might arise.
Exactly. And it's not about being pessimistic or focusing only on the negative. It's about being realistic and making sure we have a balanced understanding of all the potential outcomes.
So it's like we're playing a game of intellectual chess, thinking several moves ahead and considering all the possible scenarios.
I like that analogy. And one of the best ways to play that game well is to actively seek out dissenting opinions.
Dissenting opinions.
If everyone seems to be in total agreement, it could be a sign that some important perspectives are being silenced or overlooked.
It's like if you're thinking about making a big investment and everyone is telling you it's a sure thing, it might be wise to get a second opinion from someone who's a little more cautious.
Right. It's about challenging our own assumptions and making sure we're not getting caught up in groupthink.
This whole concept of omitted information has been so eye-opening. It's like we've been given a secret decoder ring for unlocking the hidden messages in the information we encounter every day.
I love that. And the more we practice this skill, the better we get at spotting those hidden gaps in reasoning and filling in those missing pieces.
So to wrap things up, what are some key takeaways we can apply to our everyday lives?
I think the most important takeaway is to always be on the lookout for omitted information. It's everywhere.
It is everywhere. From news articles to social media posts to conversations with friends and family, we're constantly exposed to incomplete reasoning.
So make it a habit to ask those critical questions. What's missing? What are the potential downsides? Are there any alternative viewpoints out there?
And don't be afraid to dig deeper. Seek out additional information and challenge the assumptions that are being presented to you.
Remember, critical thinking is a skill that takes practice. But the more we use it, the better we become at it. And the more empowered we are to make informed decisions in all areas of our lives.
This book, Asking the Right Questions, is a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to strengthen their critical thinking muscles. We highly recommend it.
And for more enriching book analyses like this one, be sure to subscribe to Mindful Moments. You can find a link to purchase this book in the show notes.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into critical thinking. Until next time, keep those minds sharp.